Hi, Heathens. Welcome back. I am super excited today to have Alex Vitale here with me. Those of you that have followed me for any length of time, you've already heard me talk about him. You've heard me talk about his work and how formative it was to my stance as abolitionist. And so I'm really excited for him to be here today and to have him share his knowledge, his research, and his thoughts as someone who has been studying this for decades. So without further ado, I would like to give Alex a moment to introduce himself, tell us as much or as little as you'd like, and then we will jump into the topic at hand.
Well, thanks. It's great to be with fellow heathens today. So I'm a professor of sociology at Brooklyn College and the CUNY Graduate Center, and I also have a visiting position at London South Bank University. I run a public policy shop called the Policing and Social Justice Project that works on a variety of the kinds of issues I guess we're going to talk about today. And I've been working on policing issues for 30 years now in a variety of capacities.
Thank you. So I know you wrote this book, The End of Policing, in 2017. And for anyone that follows the news, leading up to that, there was I won't say an uptick in police brutality, but certainly an uptick in what the public was able to see. And so we have people being murdered by the police, like Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Laquan Donald, Timur Rice, Freddie Gray, Jamar Clark, Alton Sterling, Philando Castile. Like the list could literally go on ad infinitum, sadly. And I'm wondering, was this something you were studying before these sort of came into the public sphere or the public sight? Or did these just did they expedite your work?
So actually, I had the deal to write this book with Verso Books before any of that happened.
Oh, wow.
You know, like I said, I've been working on policing a long time, and I had seen a growth in the literature around mass incarceration. Books like The New Jim Crow, for instance, right, had become popular. And I was also connected to these conversations about prison abolition and the thinking about how do we get out of mass incarceration by dismantling our reliance on prisons. But as someone who had worked primarily on policing, I was concerned that policing was being left out of this conversation. And, you know, nobody ends up in prison without the police getting involved.
And no one just walks
also,
in like, hey, I'd like to stay here for a while.
Yeah, exactly. And also, you know, policing produces a lot of harm in society, even if you don't get arrested. For instance, they kill over 1,000 people a year. And I thought, if we're going to really have a dramatic impact on the rate of incarceration, we've got to put policing at least in this conversation, if not at the center of it. And so I had this conversation with Verso Books, and they thought there would be, you know, enough interest in this to warrant publishing it. And then I started working on it when Ferguson happened, when Eric Garner was killed. And I decided, you know, my experience had been that the reaction to these high-profile police killings tends to be very extreme but short-lived. And I thought, if I better try to intervene in the conversation now, because that conversation may not stick around very long. So I actually put the book project aside for like 2 years, and instead I wrote like 40 essays a year, just op-eds in newspapers, magazines, wherever I could place stuff, just constantly. And then I went back to the book, which came out in 2017.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious if you could give us a brief overview of the roots of the police. I think people have a fundamental misunderstanding that the police are here to protect us. And when I start to talk to people about where the police actually come from in this country, it becomes a lot clearer that actually the police are designed to protect property and the wealthy's property, for that matter. And so I was hoping, I know you discussed it a bit in your book, but for those who haven't read it, if you could just give a brief overview of where the police come from and what purpose they're meant to serve.
Sure. You know, everyone just sort of, I think most people just sort of assume, oh, well, we've always had policing and it's looked kind of like this, but actually policing is a fairly new institution. Most police departments have been around only about 150 to close to 200 years, with one or two exceptions. So it's a very recent institutional development. And we often hear this kind of liberal narrative that says, well, policing begins in London in 1829 as this model of policing by consent and improvement over, militias and informal watches. And that policing exists to neutrally enforce the law in a way that benefits everyone. And what I have found is that policing emerges in this period about 200 years ago in relationship to regimes of profound exploitation. And those regimes in this period 200 years ago are colonialism, slavery, and mass industrialization. So what we see is that those regimes of accumulation, of exploitation, produce resistance that is both organized and disorganized. It's organized in the form of slave revolts and anti-colonial movements and labor strikes and, mass marches but also disorganized resistance in the form of bread riots, of individual crime, of disorderly behavior. And that policing works to manage, control, minimize the impact of both these formal and informal forms of resistance. So I argue that the first modern police force that fits the typical academic definition of a modern police force is the Charleston City Watch and Guard, which is formed in the late 1780s in Charleston, South Carolina, in a period where slavery is going on.
Right.
And it's a different kind of slavery than we think about usually in the South. It's not plantation slavery. Slaves actually worked outside the home of their owners in the modernizing economy. They're unloading ships, they're running warehouses, they're working in factories, workshops, different things. And so in Charleston, there are actually more Black slaves on the move every day than there are white people. And they create a police force to help manage primarily that mobile slave population. They're modern because they're professional, uniformed, civilian, 24-hour law enforcement oriented police. But the primary system of laws they're enforcing are the laws of slavery.
Right.
And this leads us to this bigger issue of like, well, isn't the enforcement of the law good for everyone? But it turns out that's not necessarily true, right? The laws of slavery were not good for slaves. The laws of colonialism were not good for colonized populations. The laws of industrialization, there's a famous 19th century saying that the law in its majesty forbids both the rich and the poor from sleeping under bridges, stealing bread, and begging in the streets.
Sure, right.
Yeah, but of course, the rich don't need to do these things. Those laws exist to criminalize poverty. And today, the war on drugs, similarly, is a legal system that was never intended to benefit everyone equally, just the opposite.
Right. I mean, how could it benefit everyone equally when in reality it's specifically designed to criminalize addicts, right? And I think,
well, not even addicts. It's designed to criminalize populations that were conceived of as political enemies, whether or not, and oftentimes it does not require that they actually be involved in drug use. It was about tarring the reputation. It was about demonizing whole communities.
Right. And this, correct me if I'm wrong, comes out of sort of the law and order rhetoric that we see popping up, where that becomes a dog whistle for brown and Black communities that are protesting sort of during the civil rights era. And so we see this sort of uptick in white folks in power using this language to not have to say Black and brown poor communities, but being able to say like, oh, the protesters or things like that, and we can sort of enforce the law. But as you said, the law at that point was designed to protect white people in power. So of course it can be applied across the board, but it's affecting people very differently.
Yeah, I mean, we now have all this information from inside the Nixon White House, who is the one who gins up the modern war on drugs, and where the people in the meeting said, oh yeah, this had nothing to do with public health, with public safety. It didn't even have anything to do with drugs. It was just a convenient tool to use to criminalize our political enemies, and also to appeal to white, historically Democratic voters in the South to switch to the Republican Party in the wake of the victories of the civil rights movement.
Yeah. And how do you think the militarization of the police during, I believe it was the Reagan administration? Am I remembering this correctly? Sorry.
Well, it happens in waves. It doesn't happen all in
Right.
one shot.
And this was when the government decided to let the Department of Defense give its surplus of military equipment to local, federal, state police forces. Now, I think we can kind of imagine what effect that might have, but can you sort of talk about that a little bit more in depth? What that did, how it affected communities, things like that?
Yeah, militarization goes way beyond the transfer of surplus weapons, the 1033 program, which is, of course, important. But after 9/11, there was a massive increase in just direct spending, just grants for police departments to buy military hardware, billions and billions of dollars of this stuff, creating a whole new domestic defense market. In addition, we've seen this explosion in the number of these police paramilitary SWAT type units, and also the kind of suffusion of training regimes that are rooted in militarized views of policing, training being offered by former special forces units and military experts, right? So that it creates this whole kind of warrior mindset. And finally, the militarization of policing has been driven by the mission, which is our elected officials have told the police to wage a war on drugs and a war on crime and a war on terror and a war on immigrants and a war on gangs, and then given the military hardware and military training. And of course, this changes the whole nature of policing, where they come to view themselves as at war with entire communities at times.
Right.
And this leads to more violence, more criminalization, and a kind of toxic politics of authoritarianism, frankly.
Right. No, I think that's an excellent point. We have an idea, and we, meaning usually liberals, or I guess Republicans as well, but in these communities that aren't as heavily policed, that the police, in fact, are here to protect and serve, right? That's what they say. But in reality, it's exactly as you say it is. They have this warrior mentality where they're at war with everything. And so, in fact, they're not trying to protect. I would be hard pressed to figure out who the police are protecting and who they're serving, because it's certainly not the communities that need it the most, right? Instead, we see broken window policing in these communities where we just install kind of tons of cops in communities that actually need other services, right? And for maybe my listeners who are unfamiliar with that term, could you speak into what broken window policing is?
So yeah, so a few things there. I mean, it's certainly true that wider, wealthier communities experience policing in a dramatically different way than poorer and less white communities do. And therefore their views about the nature of policing are very different, right? So that for those who experience very little policing, most of what they know about policing is what they see on television.
Right.
Whether it's fictional or the news, either way, it's suffused with all this propaganda. Just this idea that police are heroes that solve all our problems through the mobilization of violence and threats and arrests and coercion. And, this is incredibly misleading. It leads people to grossly overestimate the effectiveness of policing. It cancels out any conversation about the costs of policing and closes off any exploration of what we could do other than policing. So broken windows policing has been, well, let me take another step back to the earlier part of the question, which is this idea that what policing really do is create social order, which is different than enforcing the law.
Right.
Because it turns out that if you look at what police actually do all day, that the law plays a pretty minor role for most of what police do. What they're really doing is producing a kind of notion of social order. But that notion of social order is quite conservative. It has winners and losers.
Right.
And so they're using their energy to address the informal and at times formal resistance, not to colonialism and slavery in that 19th century sense, but the problems of austerity and economic dislocation, what we sometimes refer to as neoliberalism, right? This hollowing out of the economy for the benefit of the very rich at the expense of the rest of us, that produces mass homelessness, mass mental health and substance abuse problems, mass black market activity because people can't get access to decent employment. And then that's what police do all day. They chase homeless people. They go on mental health crisis calls. They deal with people having an overdose. They're not chasing serial killers. They're not chasing bank robbers.
Yeah.
And the broken windows theory, which emerges in the 80s, but begins to really be implemented in the 90s, is an ideological tool that has been used by police and politicians to justify the use of policing to address all these obviously social and economic problems. So we don't have any plan to deal with mass homelessness. We don't have any plan to deal with the opioid crisis. We don't have any plan to deal with people struggling with mental health. So instead, we're going to call those things crime and disorderly behavior, and we're going to use policing to manage them. And the broken windows theory tries to claim that our problems of crime and even community disrepair are the result of too many homeless people and not enough police.
That's the problem for sure. I live in an area that's pretty high homelessness, high crime. So I live in Oakland, California. Everybody kind of knows that. And it's incredibly depressing to me to watch these massive homeless encampments. The police come in and just, they have, like you said, they have no plan. They just come in, they make them move, they take their stuff. And it never makes any real sense to me. Like they just have to find somewhere else, right? It's like trying to expel everybody from Skid Row. Like, where are they going to go? We don't have a plan for them to go anywhere.
No.
And I know that, society at large doesn't really want to deal with that problem, doesn't want to figure out what to do. I had a guest on the other day who works with the unhoused population in LA, and he was saying, it's, people like to think of homelessness as a moral failing. And they do that because then they can sort of protect themselves from the idea that it could ever happen to them, right? Well, it's something wrong with their character, and I don't have that character flaw, therefore that won't happen to me. I'm better than that, and I don't have to deal with the sort of societal and economic roots of the problem. But I think it's a really good point that you bring up, that we've effectively just criminalized everything that we've decided we don't want to invest time, money, and resources in, right? And of course, it's not across the board, but drugs, for instance, all criminalized. And I understand why we have, illicit substances, but if you're criminalizing people for using drugs, and they're addicts, and we know addiction is a disease, how then does that disease get solved by putting people in jail, giving them a felony, not really giving them an outlet when they come out, and then having them just repeat offend? I used to volunteer at San Quentin Prison, and it's amazing to me how many people were in there, especially because of the three strikes law, for drug related charges effectively forever. And then when that sort of got those, I don't know if it was repealed, but people started having the opportunity to get out, where were they going to go, right? You went in for drug use and you come out and you have a felony now, so you can't get a place to live, really. You can't live with your family if they're in subsidized housing. It's really hard under certain circumstances to even find a halfway house to stay in. But then we've also criminalized homelessness, as you were just saying. And then we have this rampant black market where drugs are abundant and easy to get a hold of. And to be honest, probably the only thing that helps people with mental illnesses or things of that nature deal with the fact that they have really nowhere to go but back to prison. It's just this incredibly sad cycle, and it's all largely because we've decided we want the police to deal with every societal ill that comes up. But the only way that we can do that is by criminalizing every societal ill, because otherwise we can't then hand it over to the police. And I grew up with a mom who was an addict and who was mentally ill, who has lived on the street for some time, got off the street. And I've had the police at my house, or my old house, more often than I would like to recall. And while they were largely kind, I'll say they were largely decent to me. I have some pretty obvious privilege here. And the way my mom was when she was having these episodes was she would have a seizure, or she was epileptic, or, something is clearly wrong, that she's not being combative to the police. And so I was fortunate that I didn't run into this issue where they needed to physically restrain her. And this sort of leads me to my next point, because for me, it's become abundantly clear that when police respond to really any crisis, but especially a mental health crisis, if you are a person of color, your life is in far more danger than if my mom has a mental health crisis. And I am wondering if you could speak about your thoughts on sort of institutionalized racism and discrimination within the police force, and then how we see that play out in the way that they respond to calls, if you have data or research on that.
Well, so that's a lot of territory there.
Sorry, yeah.
I want to just highlight the fact that between 1.25% of all people killed by police in the United States are having a mental health crisis, and it does run the racial gamut, though it is disproportionately non-white people. And actually, the group that runs the highest, most disproportionate risk of dying at the hands of police are still Native American populations, not
Right.
African Americans. So the racial disparity issue is important and complicated, because it is certainly true that certain types of behavior that has been labeled crime occurs disproportionately among people of color, especially things like violence and shootings. And so when we construct policing in a very narrow sense, and we imagine public safety in a very narrow sense, there are a handful of specific laws that we call crime and that we turn over to policing to manage. And then that becomes a kind of self-reinforcing narrative and cycle, because policing doesn't work well to resolve those problems. So those problems fester, and then that becomes an argument for more policing or a constant justification for policing, right? So we continually double down on more of what doesn't really work.
Right.
Now, the bigger issue here is two things. One is, why are certain things labeled as crime and other things aren't? And then the other is, why are certain kinds of communities subjected to the kinds of conditions that are more likely to produce violence and street crime, right?
Very
So
simple question, right?
yeah, we live in a society where racial segregation is as widespread today as it was during the civil rights era. School segregation is actually worse than it was. African Americans in our society have almost no household wealth. And this is the result of government programs, discriminatory lending practices, discrimination in housing, etc. So these are ongoing. These are not historic issues. These are right now problems that we continue to reproduce profound racial inequalities. And then we choose certain types of things to label crime and address through policing. So for instance, if we talk about the real threats to the African American community in Oakland, yes, interpersonal shootings are a real problem there. But what about predatory lending practices? What about wage theft by employers? What about discrimination in housing? What about environmental pollution? What about the disproportionate lack of resources for libraries, parks, and schools in Black communities in Oakland? Those things have a much more powerful effect on the well-being, health, and safety of Black residents of Oakland than interpersonal violence does.
Oh, absolutely.
And of course, if we improve those conditions, wages, secure housing, parks, recreation, there wouldn't be so much interpersonal violence.
Right. Yeah. I just want to take a quick second to plug a book, if anybody is interested in how we got to a point where we have so much interpersonal crime in communities of color or in poor communities, which oftentimes overlap. The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein. Incredibly enlightening. I read it, and I mean, I already had a general understanding of why these things probably happen, but it laid out United States legal history and policy over the last 100 or so years. And I think it's really important for anyone to read, especially if you're one of those bozos that always trots out, what about Black on Black crime? Anytime crime comes up, right? There are reasons that these communities have higher crime rates, and it's not because it's something inherent in the people. It's because of all the things you just mentioned, incredibly poor resources, food deserts, no access to parks and libraries, or limited access to parks and libraries, not great employment opportunities. The list sort of goes on and on, but there is a reason, and it was by design. The US government policies did this, and now we're sitting here trying to talk about it in a bubble, right? Like without acknowledging any of these other things. And it's impossible to understand how we got here, and the role that the government has played in sort of codifying discrimination. And this book is incredibly accessible and easy to read. So I just wanted to take a second to shout that out. And of course, if you have any suggestions for people, we'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah, well, that's a great, super important book. I mean, if people are interested in Oakland, for instance, they should look at Victor Rios's book, Punished, which is about the lives of young Black and brown men and boys in Oakland, and how they experience the criminalization of every aspect of their everyday life, and the sort of macro level political and economic decisions that were made in the 70s, 80s, and 90s to produce the conditions that these young people have to grow up in.
It's heartbreaking, which feels like a really lame, sorry, I shouldn't say that word, which feels like a really useless word in this situation, and it sounds very liberal of me to say like, oh, that's so sad, but living here and seeing how it all plays out is just incredibly depressing.
Well, it's infuriating.
Yeah, I agree, because there's so many incredibly intelligent, bright, creative just spectacular humans. And you don't, here's the other thing I would like to point out. You could be the most average person in the world and you still deserve all of the rights and benefits and protections that I get or that a cishet white man gets. So when I say all of these sort of adjectives about the people that I know and meet and that exist, it's not because I think you have to be outstanding or you have to be exceptional in order to get these protections and rights. I just can't help but feel angry and sad because I see and know so many people who have so much to offer to the world that are just bogged down by all of this very intentional criminalization of everything that they ever do, simply because of who they are, where they were born, what they look like. Yeah, it's infuriating.
It's not just an issue of rights here. I think, I mean, I appreciate what you said and the rejection of like the poster boy approach or
Right.
respectability politics. That's super important. But there's an additional element here, which is I want to live in a safer, healthier society. I mean, that's really the ultimate measure here of success, or it should be. And mass policing doesn't do that.
No.
It doesn't accomplish that. It protects some people with, power and wealth from having a lot of disruption in their lives. But for the vast majority of us, it doesn't really prevent these things from happening. And it causes us to wall ourselves off.
Right.
So it's produced a society of like profound alienated individualism.
Yeah.
It's crushed any sense of solidarity that we're in this together. And so instead of trying to create a healthy society that I could move about in freely, that I could feel comfortable in, that I could experience, that I could build connections, what people do is they wall themselves off with private security guards and video cameras and fences and shopping malls, but also residential segregation in schools, right? And the othering of entire parts of our society so that I don't have to deal with them. The white flight to the suburbs and all the rest is just an abandonment of this idea that we could produce a good society for everyone.
Yeah, we could do better. We could. I think that might segue into something I was hoping we could discuss. I'm sure as everyone, that it would be impossible for folks not to be aware of this shooting in Texas that happened just last week. And it's coming out, this police response to it, which was terrible. And so from what's coming out, from what I've read, the police were just sort of outside for an hour, hanging out, while this shooter was barricaded, essentially in the room with all of these school children. And at first when I was reading these reports, I was trying to make sense of why this was, and in reality it just turns out it doesn't really make a lot of sense. But then I started hearing this rhetoric from the police department there that, one, they didn't want to go in because they were worried they would get shot, and then two, that actually the police aren't obligated to put their lives on the line for you. They're not obligated to protect you. And this, even as much as I have read and researched about the police or prisons or things like this, that caught me off guard a little bit. And so I sort of went down a little rabbit hole and started reading about the Castle Rock versus Gonzalez case, which is, I know there was a case before that. This is just the one that I happened to go down, where this woman basically said, you should have protected me from, or my children from, my husband, who I had this restraining order against. And I think her children actually ended up either dead or severely wounded. And the Supreme Court ruled with Scalia, RIP, I guess, taking the opinion there and saying like, yeah, actually the police don't have to protect you. And so if we live in a country in which our police force is not actually obligated to protect us, then are they just there to be used against us? It's
Well, that is, you're starting to ask some of the right questions here. Like, what is the point? What is the end goal? What is the point of all this? So look, the situation in Uvalde, we still don't have all the answers.
Right.
What we know, though, is that there was no shortage of police. There
Never is.
was a school police officer on the scene within minutes before the shooter entered the building. There were huge numbers of police in the school within minutes. There were multiple SWAT teams, within a few minutes. So this idea that the problem is that there aren't enough people with guns around turns out just not to be true, right? Or that they don't have the right guns or the right equipment, right? So we have, as a society, we've created this myth that people with guns are the solution to our problems. That's how we produce safety, is to put more guns into our lives. The whole myth of the good guy with guns. And this is not only ridiculous, it's incredibly dangerous. No matter how quickly the police respond or how vigorously or forcefully the police respond, it's too late.
Yeah.
There are bodies all over the place. I mean, there were armed police at Columbine High School when the shooters arrived. There were armed police at Parkland High School when the shooter arrived. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work. Even at its best, it's too little too late. We have got to approach this in a completely different way. We have got to start thinking about, why is the United States the only country on the planet where this happens, right? This is not wired into human DNA. That we have a deeply broken society, and this is one expression of that. And so, yes, we need to do something about the guns. I mean, I would love to see an assault weapons ban and lots of the stuff that's being talked about, but we don't have to wait to fix the gridlock in DC to do something about this.
Right.
We could be creating all kinds of early interventions and early warning systems outside of the criminal legal system that could allow us to really make a difference here. The FBI a few years ago studied these shootings and found that in 90% of the cases, there were people who knew ahead of time, but they didn't know what to do about it, or they called police and the police didn't know what to do about it. And
boy, do I feel safe.
Yeah, exactly. So what Uvalde has helped us to see a little more clearly is that policing is not the solution to every problem. It actually doesn't work that well. They had all the training, all the technology, they were there immediately, and it just didn't work. And this happens all the time.
Yeah. I think that point really will sort of parlay us into the last couple of questions that I have for you. I've heard a lot of political rhetoric after this shooting and after every shooting that is, quite frankly, dystopian. They want to turn schools effectively, and by they, I mean the conservative right. They would like to turn schools into effectively maximum security prisons, right? They want to have more armed guards. They want to have metal detectors. They want, God, I don't know, bars on the windows. They want the teachers who just last week they were calling groomers to now be armed with AR-15s, right? And like, we don't have to get too deep into the political weeds, because we hear just the rhetoric on both sides, although obviously on the right, it's bonkers to me. I don't feel like liberals often do a much better job. They just sort of go back and forth. That is not to conflate the two. I'm not the kind of person that's saying like, well, both sides are the same. Certainly not. I just think that we're missing like actually important political rhetoric, and we're getting this like garbage fire of yeah, basically, let's just, turn our schools into prisons. So I'm curious, in the political discussion, in what we hear coming from the White House or from Congress or from representatives, it feels very much like everybody's talking about how the solution is more police, more guns in some way or another, right? Maybe not more guns to the teachers in the school, but it's more money to the police and to programs. And occasionally we'll hear things about police reform. I don't know if the police can be reformed, but that's another topic. So if you could change the sort of conversation that's happening in the White House, what is it now that you think is happening, and what would you like it to become, or do you think would be useful for it to become?
Well, I think we should give teachers guns so that parents quit harassing them about what books they assign.
Yeah, give them a gun and then let them teach CRT.
Exactly.
It's college level
and,
course.
And diverse literature and yes,
and books,
controversial subjects. So yes, the Biden administration is wedded to austerity politics.
Right.
Tax cuts for the rich and budget cuts for the rest of us, and using police to paper that over and trying to triangulate politics by being pro-police. So their solution to this is going to be, more money for target hardening and school police, and probably more money for police training, despite the fact that Texas has some of the most advanced active shooter training, and everybody there that day had it.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Just didn't work. Doesn't work. I've said this over and over again about a whole list of police training. So the best we can hope for, I think, is that when no one's looking, kind of on the side, they will also put some money into hiring more counselors for schools, maybe some more money for mental health services. But it will be completely inadequate, and it will be politically downplayed in favor of all the money they're giving policing to make policing more professional, better trained, better armed, better respected, and all the rest. So I don't have any optimism about what's going to happen in the short term in Washington.
Yeah, me neither.
So I think we have to approach this as a local issue. I mean, the good news is, in a sense, that policing is primarily a local matter. We're talking about local police departments funded by local tax dollars, and the potential to change this at the local level. And this is actually happening. I mean, dozens of cities in the last 2 years have gotten rid of their school police departments and hired more counselors and put in place restorative justice programs and all the rest. I'm working with folks in northern LA County, where there's a big grassroots campaign to get rid of their school police. So this is actually happening, just as there have been big victories on creating non-police mental health crisis teams, more investment in community-based anti-violence efforts, independent of policing. And I think that's the way we have to go here, is we have to continue to build local campaigns rooted in an understanding that police doesn't work that well. Policing, even when it works, is harmful. And there are things we could do instead of policing.
Yeah. So a lot of people have heard this sort of slogan, defund the police, or in more extreme cases, right, abolish the police. And I was having a discussion last night with someone who said, yeah, I get the sentiment, but like, how do you then talk to moderates and explain to them what that actually means? And my probably jaded opinion was, you don't talk to moderates, because they're never going to change their mind. Because I personally think moderates are probably the single most difficult group to get to change their mind, because they're comfortable, it doesn't affect them. But that's neither here nor there, right?
Well, no, I think it's really important, because what you're really talking about are liberals. And by liberals, I mean folks who are committed to the basic economic arrangements, but would like it to be nicer or inclusive,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
so they benefit, not just in a psychological sense, they benefit financially. They're doing very well in the global economy in a way that poor and working class people are not. And so they just like there to be a few more Black people in their club, but they don't actually have a plan for addressing the fundamental problems of our society,
Yeah.
right? This
Well, that would mean
mass.
relinquishing a lot of their power.
That's right.
They don't want to do
That's
that.
right. And so policing is always a convenient tool for them to paper over these problems, but they want that policing to be nicer and more inclusive and friendlier and less violent. But that's because they don't understand what policing is at all.
Yeah.
They have
And
this
at its core, it's
mythical
fundamentally
fantasy
different.
about policing. So here's the deal, to get to your bigger question about police abolition. Police abolition is an analysis. It's an understanding about the nature of policing and its role in society that guides our decision making right now, all kinds of very real, in the moment decisions we need to make. So police abolition says, look, policing is an inherently dangerous and problematic tool that we should try to remove from our lives in as many ways as we possibly can, rather than existing in this naive fantasy world where policing is nice and friendly,
Right.
which has never existed and never will exist. Police are violence workers tasked with reinforcing and enforcing inequality. So we should definitely disempower them in every way we can possibly do that. But there's no magical switch out there that if we just found it, poof, there would be no police and then we'll figure out what to do next.
Right.
Right. There's a massive system of policing and we have real world decisions to make right now. Should we respond to Uvalde with more money for police or more money for counselors and early warning systems? Well, an abolitionist analysis makes that decision really easy for us. No more money for police, less money for police, more money for things that actually help people. And so defund the police is just a kind of practical expression of that.
Right.
Budget priorities have been skewed so that the city of Uvalde spends 40% of every tax dollar on policing, which leaves nothing for parks, libraries, youth services, or any of the things that might actually have helped that young man.
Right. So I'm sure you've gotten this probably a million times over, because I know I have, and I am certainly not in the public eye for this topic. When someone says, okay, so you want to defund the police, you want to abolish the police, and I think anybody with a couple of brain cells can figure out that we're not meaning tomorrow we cancel every single police department in the United States and just have a free-for-all. So when people say, okay, well then who responds to mass shootings? And I know that's just one example that's come up, or who looks for serial killers, right? Who responds to bank robberies? And I would love for you to expound on that, because basically what I've said is that, like, I would imagine that at some level there has to be people that we assign to that, right? That there just has to be.
So,
but
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, but when we say abolish the police, people, because they don't actually want to engage with the topic, just sort of simplify, reduce to, well, what happens if someone breaks into your house? And first of all, if you live in Oakland, nothing. But beyond that, like, what does that look like in a sort of, in whatever it is, 20, 30, 50 years, if we're somehow able to shift all of this funding to programs and systems that really do help just make society healthier, but we are still going to have people that do bad things, right? And so what does that look like?
So in a way, right, even even when it's a genuine, well-meaning question, it's kind of an irrelevant question, because we're so far away from some moment like that, and that's not even what people are advocating, right? What people are saying is, right now we have decisions to make. Should we continue the war on drugs?
Right.
Should we continue with school policing? Should we create new gang units? Should we militarize the border? And an abolitionist says, for each of those things, actually, there's something we could do that would be better, that would make us safer, that would be more just, and that would lead us to a better world.
Not to mention a lot more humane.
Let's start doing those things. And then we look at what's left. Oh, what do we do about this? So what do we do about burglaries, right? Well, turns out first that policing does nothing about burglaries, right? So it's a myth to think, oh, well, thank God the police are there, because they do nothing.
Literally,
they do nothing, right? And first of all, the only reason most people call the police is if they have insurance and they need a report. So that could be done by civilians. And in fact, some cities are starting to do that. Just take police out of burglaries altogether. But second of all, well, what's producing burglaries? A huge amount of it is looking for money for drugs. Well, if we actually did something about the drug problem, we wouldn't have so many burglaries.
You don't
right?
say.
And then we could look at, well, what's driving the remaining burglaries? Well, usually then this is an issue of profound poverty. Well, what if we had a guaranteed minimum income? What if we had living wages for people, right? Burglaries would largely evaporate.
Yeah.
Now, there's no world that I can imagine, right, where there's no harm. We have a society right now with a massive amount of harm and a massive system of policing. What I'm trying to get us to is a situation where we have a lot less harm than we have now and a lot less policing.
Yeah.
And this is totally possible. As we move there, there's still going to be policing. And a lot of that policing is actually going to do more harm than good. But if there's a shootout in the street, I'm sure that police will come. What
Right.
I'm going to be working on is how to stop those shootouts from happening in the first place.
Right. Right. This is completely anecdotal, but just for folks to get an understanding of how useless the police actually are. I have a relatively new car. It comes with, I think it's like on track or something. Basically, I can track my car. So, and I can also deactivate it remotely. So the other day, a couple months back, my car was stolen. And I called the police and they said, okay, we'll send someone out. Great. I waited and waited. No, nobody's coming. I probably called them 3 to 5 times that day. Nobody's coming, but somebody will be there. Somebody will be there. Somebody will be there. Like, all right. So by that evening, because I'd called in the morning, I ultimately had my friend drive me down to the police station because I needed to make a police report. Like you said, I had to make it so that I could get my car company to track my car, and I could track my car to turn it off. So I go down to the police station. The door is locked. They're not closed. It's just locked. And I have to bang on the door to get the one guy in there to come out and basically ask me what the hell I wanted. And I said, well, my car was stolen. I need to file this report because otherwise I can't deactivate it. And people were just, I can see it just driving my car around. And so finally we do the report. I ask him, how do I connect you with my people? He said, oh, we'll do it. Okay, great. I get home, I call the car people. No, he didn't call. They're not going to call. Okay, so I have to set them up, get them connected. Great. You guys are connected. My car is now disabled. And we know exactly where it is. I don't know exactly where it is because they won't tell me because they don't want me to go down there, which fine. But the police know exactly where it is. And it still took several days for them to just go to my car. It was stopped. It couldn't move. Like they knew where it was. And then just let the tow truck basically take it to the yard. And again, I know it's completely anecdotal. I know it's sort of small time because, whatever, it's not like anyone's having their house robbed, but I know people that in fact have had their house robbed and the police don't show up for days, right? It's already done. What are they going to do about it? They're not going to stop anybody. They're going to come and do exactly what you said, which is effectively fill out a report. They have not made anybody safer. And they likely all they did was allow someone to just sort of get some of their money back to sort of, that's it, right? Police show up on scene after people have been shot, after they've been killed. The instances of police showing up when there is a crime ongoing and actually getting you out safely, that is such a small percentage of the time that I'm just sort of confirming exactly what you're saying, that like, even if we left that out and said, okay, we need police for that, if we could get rid of this 98% of other sort of unnecessary crime by providing economic, education, employment, all of these things, sorry, not economic, job opportunities, things like that, that little percentage of the time the police actually need to show up and do something when you're actually in danger, not only would they be more likely to actually show up when you call, it would be such a small percentage of the time because people would be having their needs met. And so a lot of these sort of economic based crimes just wouldn't be happening. Anyway.
Well, I recommend that if people want to like really delve into this a bit more, they could start with Derica Purnell's book, Becoming Abolitionists, with an S at the end, Abolitionists. It's a really excellent exploration of these issues from someone, who experienced a lot of crime and violence in their life.
Yeah, absolutely. So on that note, I want to say thank you so much for being here. It has been such a privilege because you have played an important role in my life. So thank you. I'm going to not get emotional. Can you let the people here know where they can find you, how they can support you, what work you have out, and what's upcoming for you?
Great. So people can follow me on Twitter at Vitale, Avitale. And the Policing and Social Justice Project is at PolicingJ. And we're currently doing a rare little fundraising effort to try to build up our internship research associate program to create the next generation of scholar activists. So we have a GoFundMe for the Policing and Social Justice Project, and it would be great if people could chip something into that.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for being here. It's been an honor and a pleasure, and I know that people are going to learn so much from this. So thank you again, and hopefully we can do it again sometime.
My pleasure.
Have a nice day.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.